Hi, my name is Katherine Autin, and we're going to tell our story of Parkinson's disease. My husband here, David, was diagnosed in 2004, and we feel it's important to tell this story because there are a lot of people out there suffering with this disease, and it's so complicated that it helps to hear everybody's story so we can learn from each other. When he was diagnosed, and he can tell you this, he thought he was kind of losing his mind. He was a speaker for the company, the group that he worked with, the federal government, and there were times when he would get up and speak and he would forget his words. He would look visibly nervous, and I kept saying, okay, we got to go back to the doctor. It took us 3 years to get the diagnosis, and that's not uncommon. So as time went on, and you'll notice me pushing him a little bit sometimes. One of the symptoms of Parkinson's is leaning. Very often they can lean and fall out of a chair, so I have to watch him carefully here. But I wanted to tell our story because I think it's helpful, but also because I'm really proud of my husband, the way that he's been proactive with this disease. When he was diagnosed, he was happy. He was like, oh, I'm not losing my mind. And the doctor said, well, Parkinson's isn't so bad. And we both kind of looked at each other, and the doctor said, okay, well, here's your medicine, and I'll see you in a year. And we walked out the door. We looked at each other and went, well, now what? Neither one of us knew anyone with Parkinson's. So luckily, a local group here, the Parkinson Support Center of Kentuckiana in Louisville, Kentucky, connected up with me, and I actually started running support groups. It was a good way to find out about the disease. David came with me, and it was the beginning of my connection with the Parkinson's community. And David can tell you that one of the things that immediately it made it difficult for him at work, he didn't tell anybody, right?
Right.
He didn't tell anybody that he had the disease, but they knew something was wrong. They just didn't know what. And most people couldn't tell that he had Parkinson's because he did not have the tremor. Most people have a tremor with Parkinson's. He didn't have a tremor. He had rigidity, freezing, low voice, balance issues. When you walked, you only swung one arm. That was one of the characteristic signs of Parkinson's that the doctor told us about. And so as time went on, I served on the board at the Parkinson Support Center for 4 years, and during that time, David came with me to the support groups that I ran, and we really became family with the folks who had Parkinson's in their families. And one of the things that happened as time went on, David went back to writing his poetry, which he'd written since he was, 12?
Around there.
Yeah, around 12 years old. And so he's a prolific writer, and he used to speak for hours at a time, but because of Parkinson's, that kind of stopped a little bit. He was lucky enough, not long after he was diagnosed, he'd been working in an office, and it was becoming difficult for him, but he was offered a job, which is rare in the government, to work at home. And because of that, he could work a little bit longer. But eventually, he got to the point where
It was not possible to perform the functions in my office. I depended heavily on speaking to people, writing, telephone, telex, and as you can see by my hesitation now, all of those functions began to get increasingly difficult. I realized at one point that I was no longer able to perform the functions of the job in a way appropriate to it. And so I was reluctantly forced to resign from the U.S. Department of Commerce.
But David thinks of himself as Parkinson's defiant. And I admire that, and he inspired me to stay involved with the Parkinson's community. So I was an advocate. I was out talking about Parkinson's, trying to help people understand that there's a lot more to it than just a tremor, which is what most people think of as Parkinson's. And he began, because he had to retire, And I'll tell you the story of the retirement was he went into the hospital for the rehab hospital here for about 2 weeks because they were trying to redo his medicines, sort of like a medicine holiday, if you will. And when he came out, it was about 2 weeks later, and he said, I have to retire. Well, I just about fell off my chair, and you know, he was only diagnosed at 51, and I'm thinking, whoa, 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 what's going on with our lives? But for him, it was a good thing. We downsized, we moved into a smaller house, we rented a house, and a part of our story, which is really hard for people to hear, but I think it's important, is we had to go bankrupt. We had a medical bankruptcy, and it completely changed our lives. Our 27-year-old son moved in with us to help us, and he was such a godsend. I thank God for him every day. He lived with us for 8 years. He just moved out a year ago, and I'm really proud of him, Michael. But in the meantime, David, because he wasn't working, began to do the thing that he loved the most, which is poetry. And a few years ago, after working diligently during some of his worst times with Parkinson's, David wrote a book and self-published it. It's called Birds Only Sing to Those Who Listen. And he's going to read you one of these poems, and while he reads it, you can hear his Parkinson's. But this is his love, and Parkinson's actually freed him up. So there was a positive thing in what happened. You know, you can't say too many things positive about Parkinson's, but do you want to read your poem, hon?
Certainly. One of the advantages of writing poetry is an occupation for Parkinson's. Is that when you're frozen, you can still write poetry in your head. That's always the ideal activity for me. I can do it any time, day or night. This is the poem that the book itself is named after, called Birds Only Sing. Birds only sing to those who listen. Stars only shine for those who look. For people who approach it with the proper disposition, life is not a problem, but an open book. Attitude is everything. Do yourself a favor. Be enthusiastic in everything you do. The secret of the most delicious dishes is the savor that you bring to them, not what they bring to you. Our sins against ourselves are mainly sins of omission, the chances that we missed, rather than the risks we took. For birds only sing to those who listen, and stars only shine for those who look.
This is one of many of his poems in the book, and the artwork was done by our son, Michael David, and we're really proud of him as well.
One thing about my poetry I would like to mention is that I see the poetry as an act of defiance against my condition, my Parkinson's. It's not that I deny that I have Parkinson's, but I don't want it to rule my life. And so I've always made it a point to write poetry on topics other than my Parkinson's disease. I had one poem which I wrote, which covers the circumstances of my illness. But other than that one poem, all the others deal with fantasies or serious topics, theology, but always some things that had nothing directly to do with my condition. Most people would probably focus on it as a way of learning how to come to grips with their illness. But I find that I prefer turning my back on it entirely and leaving this part of my life unpolluted, uncontrolled by Parkinson's.
You want to read that? That's one poem. The one poem that he wrote about Parkinson's is one that I actually use when I do training with Parkinson's.
It's called In the Cradle of Lassitudes, Waking with Parkinson's Disease. I wake in darkness as the newborn dead wake cradled in their coffins, so I in my bed. Unaccustomed lassitudes weigh down each limb like lead. I cannot find the strength to lift my head. My wife breathes softly. I won't awaken her. I test my limbs once more, urge each in turn to stir. But flesh lies heavy, the bedclothes heavier, and no comfort comes from my comforter. Once I moved as others move, without a thought, turned over in bed to find the comfort I sought. But now each limb must be painfully retaught to do again what once it knew and forgot. I try again, but strange, sad thoughts fill my head, thoughts rather of pity than of panic or dread. Is this how it is when they hear the last tread of mourners retreat, and their requiem said, the dead wake again, and find they are dead?
One of the pieces of our story is what's been going on. My husband has been in and out of the hospital over the last 13 and a half years many times. We have had him on many different types of medications. He was on a clinical trial last year, which unfortunately didn't end in the best situation, but it was a good experience. And I think at this point, you can see he's having some difficulty sitting up. And we usually, when he has an issue where he's starting to lean a lot and the medicine's not working as well, I usually give him an injection of apomorphine. If anyone has heard of that, it's a rescue dose. So even though I'm not a nurse, I've had to become a nurse to be there as a caregiver for my husband. And I feel like we're doing a day at a time with this disease, as most people with Parkinson's are. But I know David has a really good attitude about this and tries to be as positive as he can. He inspires me. And it's because of him and the entire Parkinson's community that 5.5 years ago, I started a company to be a patient advocate for folks with Parkinson's.
I think it's useful to get the perspective on Parkinson's from the patient's point of view as well as from the caregiver's point of view. As somebody who deals with the disease on a day-to-day basis and is its own person, it's remarkable adventure almost that it takes you through. When I first was diagnosed, there were certain symptoms that I had, such as my inability to speak well, handwriting, typing, which had become increasingly difficult. And those were the things that were worrying me, and which I was relieved with the diagnosis of Parkinson's to finally have an explanation for. But the long haul, the long perspective, this is called freezing. Freezing is something that happens with Parkinson's patients. They're unable to move or unable to take the next step, to walk into a room, because the freezing symptoms has manifested itself. One of the characteristics of Parkinson's is that it is a slow and progressive disease. When you first get it, your symptoms are at a minimal point, but they grow more intense over time. The advantage of Parkinson's is because it is slow progression. It gives you opportunity to come to grips with the new symptoms and the difficulties it poses for you. The negative side of that, of course, is that life is a perpetual challenge. The conditions and the circumstances will change, sometimes on a daily basis. And so you're always facing the next phase of the challenge, which is Parkinson's. But as I've experienced in my own life, if you take it, approach it with a positive attitude, maintain your sense of humor, cultivate a sense of patience, and stick to your regimen of medications and exercise, then you can have a very positive life, doing things like writing books of poetry and fulfilling aspirations that you would have had in any case, even in a life blessed without Parkinson's disease.
Like travel.
Travel.
we've done the bucket list things in the last few years, traveling. You can tell them where we went if you want.
I had always had two big dream vacations I'd always wanted to take. The first one was to Europe. Now, I'd been in Europe before, but I missed Greece. Just did not have the opportunity to go on the first trip there. And it had always been my dream to see Greece and the other areas of the classical world. 4 years ago, we went with some friends on a cruise. Went to Mykonos, Athens, to Istanbul, which is one of the most beautiful cities in the world.
Don't forget Santorini.
Santorini. The second trip was one to the American Northwest, to Seattle, Vancouver, Yellowstone, Victoria, British Columbia. Thanks to medications that I had that made it possible for me to travel, we were able to realize these two dream tours, which I'd dreamt of really since I was a young man.
And now, day by day, we're trying new medications. We've gone back to some old medications and dropped other medications, and it's a daily journey, but we're doing it together. And as a caregiver, it takes a lot of patience, takes a learning the details and understanding what's going on and not assuming you know. If you look at somebody with Parkinson's, you think, oh, well, that's going on. But there may be other things going on that you're not aware of. So you learn a lot as you go along. In 13 and a half years, we've learned together.
That's true.
It's a journey.